The pre-wedding party for Nia Carter and her fiancé, Eric Bradshaw, was at its peak. The aromas of delicious food wafted through the air, and the twinkling lights of the lanterns created a cozy and romantic atmosphere. Jennifer Carter, Nia's mother, had put her heart and soul into the evening. Her daughter's wedding was an event she was truly proud of. Everything looked perfect, from the harmoniously coordinated decor to the warm atmosphere. Nia, in her soft pink dress, glowed with happiness. Her eyes, as deep and warm as her mother's, shone with joy and anticipation. The bride-to-be, surrounded by her friends, discussed the details of the upcoming day with a slight nervousness, as every bride should. Eric, tall with a good-natured smile, was always at her side, never taking his eyes off his future wife. Each time their gazes met, they reflected so much tenderness that it didn't escape any of the guests. Among the invitees was Darius Williams, Nia's childhood friend. His role in Nia's life had always been secondary, but he was one of those people who never disappeared. Always there somewhere, always ready to help, always in the shadows. His quiet smile and easy conversations with the other guests didn't stand out. He blended into the crowd. Darius, though present, didn't draw much attention to himself. In the garden, surrounded by fragrant flowers and burning candles, Nia and Eric looked like the epitome of young love. Friends and family flanked them, marveling at their story and the culmination of their wedding day. Jennifer was nearby, smiling at her daughter. Pride shone in her eyes. "You're just glowing," one of Nia's friends, Marissa, remarked, hugging her. "I'm so happy for you." "Thank you, Marissa," Nia replied with a soft smile. "Everything seems so real. Sometimes I think it's a dream." Eric walked over and hugged her from behind, kissing the top of her head. "This isn't a dream," he whispered in her ear. "We are here, and this is our life." The guests laughed, and Jennifer moved closer, taking a glass of champagne. Her dress, understatedly elegant, emphasized her status as the hostess of the evening. She raised her glass, turning to the audience, and made a toast. "My dears," she began, looking at Nia with motherly affection. "Nia, my girl, I always knew you would find love. You have always been a light in this world for me, and today, I want to congratulate you and Eric on finding each other. May your lives be full of happiness and love, and may this evening be just the beginning of a long journey together." Everyone raised their glasses, and the clinking of crystal resounded in the air. The guests drank, laughed, and enjoyed the moment, while Nia hugged her mother, feeling deeply grateful for this wonderful evening. Eric thanked Jennifer for her help with the organization and the support she'd given them both. Jennifer looked pleased and slightly flustered, but Darius, standing nearby, noticed something in her gaze as she looked at Eric. He caught a glimpse of the moment, not really paying much attention to it after all. The commotion of the evening could explain any strange emotions. The toast was followed by another wave of congratulations and warm words from friends and family. As the time passed, the guests began to dance to the soft music flowing from the speakers in the garden. Jennifer, once again the center of attention, filled the space with her energy and liveliness. As the hostess, she moved fluidly between the guests, making light conversation. Nia and Eric danced without taking their eyes off each other. Their movements were effortless, like two people who understood each other perfectly, as if nothing around them existed. When Nia stepped aside for a moment to greet a relative, Jennifer walked over to Eric. They exchanged a few words, and her hand briefly touched his shoulder. It was a barely noticeable gesture, innocent, perhaps, but if one were watching closely, as Darius sometimes did, it might have seemed like there was some casual intimacy between them. Without realizing it, Darius had noticed the brief moment, but hadn't given it much thought. All evening, he had been absorbed in light conversation with Nia's friends, watching the festivities unfold from the periphery, as if through a glass. When Nia returned to Eric, they intertwined their hands again and continued to dance. Jennifer, smiling, stepped aside to watch them, her expression a peculiar mixture of pride and sadness. It was the look of a mother who had lost something important in her life, but wouldn't allow herself to show it. Later, as the evening drew to a close, Jennifer gave another speech. Her voice carried joy and confidence that Nia and Eric would be happy together. The guests left full of pleasant impressions, and the Carter house gradually fell into silence. The last to leave were Nia's close friends, including Darius, who remained in the background, keeping all his thoughts and feelings to himself. He wished Nia and Eric a good night, said goodbye to Jennifer, and disappeared into the night like so many other guests. When everyone had gone, Jennifer stood at the window, gazing thoughtfully out into the garden where her daughter's laughter had echoed not long ago. Her thoughts were distant, perhaps focused on something she hadn't told anyone. The preparations for Nia and Eric's wedding gathered momentum. Nia was immersed in a myriad of tasks, choosing flowers, approving the menu, trying on her wedding dress, all in a rhythm of anticipation for the most important day of her life. However, as the wedding drew closer, anxious thoughts began to creep into Nia's heart. Eric, who had recently seemed like the perfect groom, began to drift away. He lingered more and more at her mother's house, either discussing the details of the ceremony or just stopping by for coffee. Though it seemed innocent at first, Nia couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. One day, while sitting at the kitchen table filling out the guest list, Eric came home. He had a tired but satisfied expression on his face. "Were you at my mom's again?" Nia asked, trying to keep her voice light. "Yes," Eric replied, tossing his jacket on a chair. "We were discussing music and jewelry. She said she wanted to surprise you." Nia smiled weakly and nodded, but something nagged at her. Her mother had always been thoughtful, but she never imposed her ideas, much less tried to take control of the wedding preparations. At first, Nia brushed the thought aside, thinking she was just nervous about the wedding. But as the days progressed, the anxiety didn't fade. He didn't want to be the one to ruin Nia's happiness, but his suspicions were only growing, and deep down, he already knew that the truth would inevitably come out. It would be too painful for everyone. The evening promised to be like so many others lately. Calm, quiet, familiar. Nia, drowning in her thoughts, tried again to distract herself from the mounting anxiety that had plagued her for the past weeks. She sat on the couch, going through the photos for her wedding album, but her thoughts kept returning to what had happened between Eric and her mother. She tried to convince herself that it was all just her fantasy, that she was just too nervous about the wedding. But the suspicions were becoming more and more apparent. Nia could no longer ignore the fact that her relationship with Eric was beginning to cool, and Jennifer was starting to catch her eye too often around her fiancé. That evening, Eric again said he had to stop by her mother's house to discuss the final details of the wedding. This time, Nia decided to follow him. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but her intuition told her that the truth lurked somewhere on the surface. She threw on her coat and quietly walked out of the house, trying not to attract attention. Jennifer's house was only a few blocks away, and Nia reached it quickly, hiding behind the trees along the sidewalk. As she approached the house, she saw a light on in the window. Through the ajar curtains, she could make out the silhouettes of two people. One of them was Eric. His figure she recognized immediately. The other silhouette was her mother's. Their voices were muffled and unintelligible, but what she saw next made her heart stop. Eric and Jennifer were standing side by side, a little too close. Their conversation was soft but tense, and then Nia saw her mother slowly reach out and touch Eric's face. He didn't pull away. On the contrary, their movements became even more explicit. Jennifer gently ran her hand over his cheek, and the next second, their lips came together in a kiss. Nia's world collapsed in an instant. She stared at them as if paralyzed, unable to believe her eyes. Her fiancé and her mother, the two closest people, betrayed her at the most important time of her life. Nia's heart clenched in excruciating pain, as if a knife had pierced her chest. She couldn't breathe. Her hands trembled, and 1,000 thoughts swirled in her head, but none of them could explain what had happened. Nia stepped back, barely holding back her sobs. She wanted to rush to them, to scream, to ask them how they could do this to her. But instead, she turned and ran. Tears streamed down her face, mixing with the cold Iowa wind. She couldn't see the road, couldn't feel the ground beneath her feet. She just ran, trying to get away from the horrible sight she had just seen. Her thoughts darted from one to the other, and none of them brought her comfort. Why? Why her mother? How could they? These questions plagued her mind, but there was no answer. At some point, Nia stopped, slumped to the ground in a deserted park. There, in the darkness, she allowed herself to cry out all the pain that had built up in her heart. Meanwhile, outside Jennifer's house, across the street, nearby stood Darius. He happened to be there by chance. His worry for Nia had been keeping him busy for the past few days, and he had decided to visit her mother under the pretext of helping with the jewelry for the wedding. However, as he approached Jennifer's house, his attention was caught by two silhouettes in the window. He stopped, noticing Eric and Jennifer standing side by side. He didn't initially realize what was going on, but when their lips met, the blood in his veins boiled. He instantly realized what was happening, and rage swept over him with such force that he found it hard to breathe. Darius had never liked Eric. He had thought him unworthy of Nia. But now, he saw in Eric not just a rival, but a traitor who was ruining the life of the one he himself had loved for so long. It had cost him a great effort to keep himself from bursting into the house and lashing out at Eric. He stood there, fists clenched, looking out the window at what was happening. His hands were shaking with anger, his heart pounding in his chest as if ready to burst out. But instead of acting, Darius remained standing in the shadows, watching the scene. He felt something inside him break as a storm of emotions took over his mind. All he felt was a desire to protect Nia at all costs. The next morning, Iowa woke up to silence, broken only by the sounds of police sirens. A crowd of people had gathered in the small suburban neighborhood where Eric lived, looking at what was happening outside Jennifer's house. On the ground lay the body of a man, Eric. He was found in the backyard near a gate leading into a wooded area. Nia was awakened by a phone call. On the other end of the line was a police officer. His voice was calm, but there was a heaviness to it. "Miss Carter," he began, "I'm sorry, but we found Eric Bradshaw's body. He was murdered." The officer's words sounded like a thunderclap. Nia, who only yesterday had lost faith in her fiancé, now faced his death. Her hands shook as she dropped the phone and wrapped her arms around her head. Thoughts swarmed through her mind. She had just lost two of the most important people in her life, one to betrayal and the other to a brutal death. She drove to the crime scene, barely able to hold herself together. Police cars flashed their lights, and neighbors stood around whispering various assumptions in each other's ears. As Nia approached the fence line, she was met by a detective who had already begun his investigation. "We found him here." He pointed to a small lawn outside Jennifer's house. "I think he was trying to escape." Nia remained silent. She knew she couldn't tell the police what she had seen yesterday. She couldn't ruin her mother's life. But what if her mother was the one involved? A whirlwind of thoughts swirled in Nia's head. She was shocked, but it was suspicion that plagued her the most. Could her mother, a woman who had always seemed so loving and caring, really have been involved in the murder? Jennifer looked distressed as she was led out of the house for questioning. She was clearly shocked by what had happened. The police questions poured in one after another, but she stood firm, denying any involvement in the murder. "Eric and I were just discussing the wedding," she repeated. "I went to bed early and didn't see him after he left the house." However, the police couldn't ignore the tension in the air. The fact that Eric's body was found right next to her house, footprints on the ground, and drops of blood all led them back to Jennifer's house. Suspicions were growing, and the pressure on Jennifer was getting stronger and stronger. Nia couldn't watch what was happening. she stood back, feeling her world crumbling again. Her mother, her fiancé, everything she knew and believed in had turned out to be lies and betrayal. But who killed Eric? Was it a desperate act of jealousy on her mother's part, or was someone else behind it? Darius kept a low profile as he watched. He seemed calm, though he was torn with emotion inside. He knew Nia was going through a painful time, and he wanted to be there for her. The morning of that day was cool and foggy. Police cars with blinkers surrounded Jennifer's house, cordoning off the area. Neighbors stood nearby, whispering the latest rumors to each other. Journalists had already begun to arrive, their cameras trying to catch every moment, hoping for a scoop. The city was shaken by the news of the sudden death of a young man who had recently seemed happy and full of hope for the future. Detective Leela Walker, one of the city's top investigators, immediately took on the case. Her sharp mind and professionalism had repeatedly allowed her to solve complex cases. An examination of the crime scene revealed that Eric had been killed by blunt force trauma to the head. There were no signs of struggle, suggesting that the killer took the victim by surprise. There were scattered footprints around the body that led to Jennifer's house. Detectives began by interviewing Jennifer herself. She looked depressed and exhausted but tried to hold it together. "I don't know anything. I went to bed when Eric left," she said quietly, barely looking the detectives in the eye. Jennifer's words didn't inspire confidence, especially since Eric's body had been found on her property. What's more, when the forensics team had inspected the house, they'd found several marks that suggested there had been more than just a discussion about the wedding between Eric and Jennifer. But Detective Walker was in no hurry to jump to conclusions. She realized that the case wasn't as simple as it seemed at first glance. It was obvious that Jennifer was hiding something. But was it related to the murder? The police officers began a more detailed search of her home and found a few more things that piqued their interest. One of the police officers, while looking around the backyard, noticed small footprints near where the body had been found. These footprints clearly belonged to someone wearing shoes smaller than Eric's, but larger than Jennifer's. They indicated that someone else was at the scene, but the footprints were interrupted at the gate leading into the wooded area. That led the detectives to believe that the killer might have escaped that way. And now they needed to figure out who it might have been. Nia, meanwhile, was in a state of shock. Her world had completely shattered. She had lost not only her fiancé, but also her trust in her mother, who was the most important person in her life. Now, she didn't know what to think. Could her mother have had anything to do with this? Could the betrayal have gone so far that she would have killed Eric to cover up her affair? Days passed, and the investigation slowly progressed. The cops were scrutinizing the alibis of everyone at the pre-wedding party. All eyes were on Jennifer, and she remained under suspicion. But with each passing day, the evidence that could prove her guilt became less and less convincing. Detective Walker went over the evidence again and again, but something didn't add up. Her intuition told her that Jennifer wasn't the killer, despite the circumstances. Testimony from neighbors said that no one had heard any noise or screams that night. Video cameras on neighboring houses hadn't recorded anything suspicious. But the detective couldn't shake the feeling that the killer was still out there, and he was closer than he looked. Meanwhile, Darius continued to be on the periphery of events. He had been Nia's friend since childhood, and while he never drew much attention to himself, his presence was constant. At first, he seemed like an ordinary friend supporting Nia in her time of need. But Detective Walker, paying attention to everyone involved with Nia and Eric, began to wonder what this young man's motives were. She gathered data on Darius, his unassuming job, his quiet and calm demeanor, his lack of serious problems with the law. At first glance, he didn't seem suspicious. However, Walker decided that was too perfect. She started digging deeper and soon discovered something interesting. Nia and Eric's neighbors had noted that Darius visited them often, even when Nia was busy or absent. He always seemed overly involved in her life, even though he wasn't related to her. It didn't seem strange at first. people had remained close friends since childhood. But the more the detectives talked to people around them, the more details surfaced that could point to Darius's hidden feelings for Nia. One of the key moments in the investigation came when detectives found a small notebook in Darius's home. It contained notes and thoughts about Nia in which he described his feelings for her. He was clearly in love with her, but his feelings remained unrequited. Some of the notes even seemed obsessive. He detailed her daily activities, encounters, and thoughts that seemed to be the result of his constant observation of her. These notes led detectives to believe that Darius may have been more involved in what happened than first thought. Was the murder an act of jealousy? Could Darius have learned of Eric and Jennifer's affair and decided to kill to protect his lover from pain? Darius's inner contradictions, which had seemed hidden from everyone, began to come to the surface. Detective Walker was in no hurry to jump to conclusions, but she could already see that Darius could be the missing piece in this tangled puzzle. For days, the investigative team had been discreetly following him, studying his behavior and routes. Darius seemed calm, but his constant presence around Nia was beginning to alarm them. Just when all of Detective Walker's thoughts were beginning to come together, there was a breakthrough. The police had obtained data from a surveillance camera installed in a nearby store that captured Darius walking near Jennifer's house on the night of the murder. It wasn't obvious dirt, but the detectives had enough evidence to start investigating him more seriously. The evidence against Jennifer was getting shakier and shakier, and suspicion was shifting more and more toward Darius. He knew too much, was too close to Nia, and too involved in her life. But how and why had he ended up near Jennifer's house that fateful night? The tricky part was that none of the suspects had revealed their true motives. Jennifer, despite her affair with Eric, seemed genuinely shaken by his death. Nia, despite her suspicion, couldn't believe her mother was guilty. But Darius, with his latent love for Nia and hatred for Eric, was now a major player in the case. The investigation continued, and each new fact, each new observation, brought the detectives closer to a clue. Detective Leela Walker stood at the window of her office, looking out at the busy city streets. Her thoughts were focused on the murder of Eric Bradshaw. Although all the evidence pointed to Jennifer Carter, her intuition told her that the answer lay elsewhere. She went over the details of the case in her head, until her gaze stopped on a photograph of Darius Williams, Nia Carter's childhood friend. Something about his demeanor and constant presence around Nia made her uneasy. Walker remembered the notebook she'd found at Darius's house, full of obsessive thoughts about Nia. Those notes, coupled with the videotape of Darius being seen near the crime scene the night of the murder, formed a new theory in her mind. The detective decided to take action. She called Darius in for questioning, hoping she could uncover his true motives. When Darius entered the interrogation room, Walker studied him carefully. He looked calm, but she could read the tension in his eyes. Walker began the interrogation with the usual questions, gradually bringing the conversation to the night of the murder. She noticed Darius tense up slightly when she mentioned the videotape. His answers became more evasive, and the detective realized she was on the right track. Realizing that direct pressure would not get her a confession, Walker decided to change tactics. She started talking about Nia, about how hard it was for her, and how she needed support. Darius's eyes lit up when he heard Nia's name, and the detective realized she had found his weak spot. Walker continued to talk about Nia, watching Darius's reaction. She mentioned how Nia had talked about him, calling him her most loyal friend. At those words, Darius visibly tensed, his hands clenched into fists. The detective realized that the word friend had struck a nerve with him. After the interrogation, Walker was sure that Darius was hiding something. She decided to take a chance and talk to Nia. Meeting with her, the detective carefully laid out her suspicions. Nia was shocked, not believing that Darius could have been involved in Eric's murder. Walker proposed a plan. Nia had to confess her love to Darius to get him to open up. At first, Nia refused, not wanting to play with her friend's feelings. But the more she thought about it, the clearer she realized that it might be the only way to find out the truth. Nia agreed to the detective's plan, realizing she had nothing more to lose. She met up with Darius in the park, where they had often walked as children. Nia's heart was torn with pain and doubt as she looked at the man she'd known all her life, unable to believe he could have been a killer. She started the conversation by reminiscing about their childhood, talking about how much Darius meant to her. Then, gathering all her resolve, Nia looked him in the eye and said the words Darius had waited his whole life to hear. She told him she loved him. The effect was instantaneous. Darius's face lit up with happiness. His eyes filled with tears. He grabbed Nia's hands, kissing them, and began to speak. The words poured out of him as if the dam that had held them back for years had finally broken. Darius spoke of his years of love for Nia, how he had always been there for her, watching over her, protecting her. He talked about how he hated Eric, thinking him unworthy of Nia. And then he began to talk about that fateful night. Nia listened, breathless, as Darius described how he'd followed Eric, how he'd seen him leaving Jennifer's house. He described how he had decided that the only way to protect Nia from the pain of betrayal was to eliminate Eric. Darius described how he waited for Eric with a bat, hiding in the shade of the trees. When Eric walked by, Darius jumped out and struck. He spoke of it as a heroic act, certain that he had saved Nia from a terrible fate. Nia listened to his confession with growing horror. She couldn't believe that the man she considered her best friend could have committed such a brutal crime. Her heart ached with pain and betrayal. When Darius finished his story, he looked at Nia with hope and love. But instead of the gratitude and understanding he expected, he saw fear and disgust in her eyes. At that moment, reality came crashing down on him. He realized that his heroic act had destroyed everything he wanted to protect. Detective Walker, who had been watching the scene from a distance, quickly approached and arrested Darius. He did not resist, still in shock at Nia's reaction. As he was led away, he continued to stare at Nia, not realizing how his plan could have turned out so horribly. Nia was left standing in the park, feeling her world crumbling again. Not only had she lost her fiancé, but also the friend she had trusted her whole life. Tears streamed down her face as she realized the magnitude of the tragedy that had played out around her. Detective Walker finished with the arrest and returned to Nia. She understood what the young woman was going through and offered her support. Nia was grateful for the concern, but felt she needed time to process everything that had happened. Back at the station, Walker reflected on the case. She was satisfied that the killer had been found, but felt bitter about the way things had turned out. The case had shown her how destructive obsession and unrequited love could be. In the days that followed, news of Darius's arrest shook the entire town. People couldn't believe that a quiet and inconspicuous young man could commit such a brutal crime. Many people sympathized with Nia, understanding the pain she was going through. Jennifer Carter was cleared of suspicion, but her reputation was severely damaged. Her affair with Eric became public, and many condemned her for betraying her daughter. She tried to talk to Nia to explain her actions, but Nia wasn't ready for that conversation. Nia felt devastated. She had lost everything she held dear: her fiancé, her mother, her best friend. She felt like she would never be able to trust anyone again. She spent her days locked in her room, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. Detective Walker continued to work on the case, preparing all the necessary paperwork for court. She often thought about Nia and how one crime could ruin so many lives. Walker hoped that in time, Nia would be able to recover from this trauma and find the strength to move on with her life. Darius was in jail awaiting trial. He still could not fully comprehend the consequences of his actions. In his mind, he was still the hero who had saved his beloved from betrayal. He wrote letters to Nia, trying to explain his motives, but she didn't respond. The city was slowly returning to normal, but this case left a deep mark in the hearts of many people. It was a warning of how far a person blinded by jealousy and obsession could go. For Nia, the long road to healing had begun. She realized that she had to relearn to trust people, to rebuild her life. It wasn't easy, but she knew she had to find the strength to move forward. Detective Walker, as she finalized the case, often returned her thoughts to this story. She thought about how easy it was to lose sight of the true culprit while focusing on the obvious suspects. This case had taught her to always trust her intuition and not overlook even the smallest details. In the end, the case became one of the most memorable of Walker's career. It showed her how complex and unpredictable human relationships can be, and how important it is to be attentive to those around us. For the residents of a small town in Iowa, the story was a warning that even the quietest places can harbor dark secrets. It taught them to be more considerate of each other, to value true friendship and love, and not to let jealousy and resentment cloud their judgment. Nia, Jennifer, and Darius all fell victim to their own mistakes and weaknesses. Their story was a tragic reminder of how important it is to be honest with yourself and others, and how destructive lies and betrayal can be. While Darius awaited trial in a jail cell, Nia began the slow process of rebuilding her life. She knew she had a long road ahead of her, but she was determined to overcome this tragedy and find new meaning in her life.